All right, if you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to Ecclesiastes. We're in the middle of a series called 66. We're studying all 66 books of the Bible, and so I was actually kind of updating and mapping this out the other day, and it's going to take us into most likely the summer or even through the summer of next year, so it'll be a little while that we're walking through this, but we're really kind of just taking a high view, kind of an overview of each of the books of the Bible, and really trying to see how they fit into the overall story of the Bible, but also to give us kind of a framework for studying them on our own. And so I by no means intend to exhaust these books. You can't do that in a lifetime, let alone in one Wednesday night. So we finished up the book of Proverbs last week, and I was looking back. I've actually taught through the book, the entire book of Ecclesiastes on a Wednesday night before as well. I love the wisdom literature. I mentioned to you guys last week that I really love the book of Proverbs, and I really love the book of Ecclesiastes, partially because it's so different. It is not, Proverbs is different, but Ecclesiastes is very different as well. It's unlike any book that you'll really read in all of the Bible. And so I had the anticipation of covering Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon tonight, but I think that was a little lofty, so I pushed Song of Solomon to next week, most likely, and we'll just cover Ecclesiastes tonight. But as we get into these books tonight and next week, I want to kind of frame how you should think of them. In many ways, both Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon are kind of like commentary. They function as commentary on Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis chapter 3. Like Proverbs, the Song of Solomon is a how-to manual for exercising dominion as Adam and Eve were commanded to in Genesis chapter 2. So if you remember, right, Adam and Eve were given a command. They were to exercise dominion over all of creation, but they were also given another command. They were commanded to be fruitful and to multiply. And so the Song of Solomon, while Proverbs is kind of wisdom in our day-to-day life, kind of a how-to for our day jobs within God's kingdom. Well, Song of Solomon focuses on the other side of that creation mandate in Genesis chapter 2. It focuses on this idea of the relationship between a husband and wife and being fruitful and increasing in number. So Song of Solomon really is all about Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. The man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Don't giggle, Gerald. Saw you starting to giggle there. But that's really what Song of Solomon is about, right? It's about the relationship between a husband and wife. And we'll talk about that more next week because there's some varying interpretations of that book. But I do believe that it is about a man and his wife. And so that's Song of Solomon. If you want to know what the union between a husband and wife is supposed to look like, read that book. And we'll talk about that next week. So if Proverbs and Song of Songs kind of give us this wisdom for operating in the world that should be the world of Genesis 2, right? So before the fall, before sin. Well, Ecclesiastes is kind of the commentary on the world after the fall, the world after Genesis chapter 3. So it's going to answer the questions, what does it look like to search for meaning in a world that's been wrecked by sin? Where meaning and purpose seems so hard to come by. That's the book of Ecclesiastes. And that's a key difference between these two books. Of course, they're both wisdom literature. They're both poetic in nature. And they're both really easy to, as you read through them, it's really easy to kind of lose the train of thought that the author was after. It's kind of easy to get lost in the twists and turns and kind of miss where the author is going in both books. And for that reason, what tends to happen really with both Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon is they're kind of mined for these little quotes. You'll see people kind of cherry pick verses out of the books, and while there can be maybe some benefit to that, it really doesn't help us understand the meaning of the book as a whole. And so that's kind of my goal for us tonight, is not just to look at some of these famous verses that you know from the book of Ecclesiastes, but really to try to understand what was Solomon's intent in writing. what was the point he's trying to make in each of the books. And it's a big task, so I want to get started. And like I said, we're going to start in the book of Ecclesiastes. Just a little bit of context as we begin. Chapter 1, verses 1 and verse 12 tell us that the author, and I kind of already tipped my hand to what I believe, and probably most of you believe as well, they tell us that the author was a son of David. And one of the ways that we see the author refer to himself in the book is he calls himself teacher, right? This word teacher. And so many obviously believe that the book of Ecclesiastes and then also the Song of Solomon is authored by Solomon, because it says it's a son of David. It says that the teacher was a king over Israel in Jerusalem. But really, just that terminology, son of David, could refer to any descendant of David's. And so there are some aspects of the book of Ecclesiastes where the king is referred to in the third person. So it kind of sounds like, well, maybe it's not Solomon. So this teacher, really, he doesn't ever say, hey, my name is Solomon, but as you study through the book, most of the clues, and what I would say is the most valid landing place on the author of this book would be Solomon himself. So what about this idea of how this book fits into this story of the Bible, the big picture of the Bible, this redemptive history that's taking place all throughout? Just a few thoughts for us tonight. First, we can think of this book, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, as really being a how-to guide to life in a fallen world. It's a how-to guide to life in a fallen world. So whereas Proverbs, and really as we'll see next week, the Song of Solomon is more of the ideal, right? Of this is what God designed and intended for life to look like apart from sin. Ecclesiastes is really kind of like, well, what does life look like in the midst of a broken, messy, chaotic world? How do we live? What's the meaning? What's the purpose? How do we make sense of all of these things? So in that sense, it kind of sits on top of the storyline of redemptive history, kind of applicable to all of redemptive history, to all time. But the second way that I think we can think of this book is as it was used by the first compilers of the Old Testament. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, even though when I say compilers of the Old Testament, I mean those who organized the Bible, right? Especially the Hebrew Bible. They got the various books and they put them together into one book, the Bible. Those people, they, while not inspired, right? They weren't, I don't believe, inspired by the Holy Spirit, specifically how to order the Old Testament Bible. They did do that, I believe, for a reason. And so it's not an inspiration, but I do think this tradition can be somewhat informative for us. So I don't know if you knew this or not, but in the initial ordering of the Old Testament, it's called the Tanakh ordering. It doesn't follow the ordering in our Bibles. So the way that the Jews would have ordered their Old Testament Bible is different than the way that we would have ordered it. So the book of Ecclesiastes, and by the way, that would have been the ordering that Jesus would have been taught. That ordering, Ecclesiastes, doesn't fall where you find it right here after the book of Proverbs. It actually sits near the end of the Old Testament Bible, and it's right there with the material that was written after the exile. So it's found between Esther and Daniel and Ezra and Nehemiah. And I think there's kind of a reason for that. Well, what would that reason be? Well, I think it's because the Jews found themselves in the middle of this exile, right? They've left their land. They find themselves kind of in a meaningless life, right? They're answering these questions about their purpose and their meaning, and they're a people who have lost their land, right? They've lost their temple. They've lost their nationhood. And so much of their identity that was found in those things is now gone. They're looking around and they're saying, well, what's the point? What's the point? That's where you find the book of Ecclesiastes. I think there's some informative help for us in understanding the book when we think about that Solomon is pointing out that even though their identity, which has been so wrapped up in these things and these promises that now seem to be gone, he's going to speak to kind of the questions that would have been raised in their minds and in their life. So kind of with that background of kind of where it fits, what's the message of this book? What's the message? Well, like in the book of Job, which we studied a few weeks ago, Ecclesiastes first poses a problem and then gives a solution to it. And the problem that it's answering is this: what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of life? Isn't it all fleeting, empty, pointless, vain? I mean, we're all just racing towards death, right? In fact, I said this today. I was talking to somebody who's having some back problems, and I said, isn't that, that's just life, right? You get old, things start to hurt, and then you die. I mean, that's kind of what Solomon says at some points in the book. I mean, we're all just racing towards death, and life is so fleeting, and it's so temporary. Isn't it just pointless? Isn't it just meaningless? Well, that's the problem that is posed at the beginning of this book. To quote chapter 1, starting in verse 2, depending on the translation you read, it might either say vanity of vanities or meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What does man gain from all his labor at which he toils under the sun? Generations come, generations go, but the earth remains forever. You skip down to verse 11 of chapter 1. There's no remembrance of former things. There's no remembrance of men of old. And even those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow. Is everything meaningless? That's the question that Solomon is asking, and it's a serious question. And the answer to this problem really will affect everything in your life, from psychological makeup to values and ethics to the very clothes we wear. The answer to that question affects every part of your life. So to give you kind of a summary or a theme of the book, I wrote it there on your handout. Here's the book's answer. I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you. Meaningful, meaningful, all is meaningful because all is ordered by an eternal, sovereign, and purposeful God. Therefore, we should fear God and rejoice in what he has given us to do and to have. So, Ecclesiastes confronts man's attempt to find meaning in the creation apart from the Creator. And it comes to the sobering conclusion that without a sovereign creator God, everything really is vanity. Everything really is meaningless. In fact, I think one of the keys to interpreting this whole entire book is a little phrase that Solomon uses over and over again, and he uses this phrase either under heaven or under the sun. And when he says that, it's a great reminder that what he's saying is when you just look at the physical world, if all you do is put on the lens of the physical, the temporary, then yeah, everything is meaningless. Everything is vanity upon vanity. But the answer that he gets to is there's more to life than just what's under the sun, what's under heaven. There's a sovereign creator God that has a plan and a purpose in all of these things that go on. So if the universe was created and is now governed by an eternal, sovereign, and purposeful God, then there really is actually great meaning and value to life. Now, notice, I did not say that the universe needs a God in order to have meaning. I didn't say the universe needs a God in order to have meaning. I said that in order for the universe and our lives in this universe to have meaning, this God must have certain attributes. He must be eternal. He must be sovereign. He must be purposeful. Not just any old God will do. Only if God in his sovereignty ordains all things that come to pass and has the power to carry out all of his plans can anything temporal like our lives ever have lasting, meaningful significance. And the God of Ecclesiastes is a sovereign God. And so everything is filled with significance because God does nothing in vain or without reason. Therefore, God is to be feared, and all things that he gives us are to be enjoyed. After all, he has good and meaningful reasons to give them to us. So this includes our jobs, our homes, our families, everything. Everything he has a reason for giving to us. So that part's kind of easy, right? Great, all those are good things. But also, it includes all our troubles, all our pains, all our sufferings, all our afflictions. These too, because our God is good, because our God is sovereign, because he is eternal and purposeful, those things too are meaningful and good. We may not understand how in this life, but we're called to trust him and believe that he's not making a single mistake in our lives. Now, I began with the first words of the book, right? Vanity of vanity, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. And I told you that the message of the book is actually the opposite, right? That everything is meaningful under an eternal, sovereign, and purposeful God. Well, how did I get from point A to point B? How did I get from how Solomon opens the book to the theme of the book that I gave you? Well, let me just give you a little bit of an overview of the structure, and I'll explain. The book begins in section 1 that I was reading from with an introduction that really serves, it essentially works as an antithesis. All is vain, right? That's the statement that Solomon is making. And he's setting up the challenge that's to be addressed. And I don't know if, I kind of wanted to do this. How many of you in here tonight would say that you are just by nature an optimist? Just lift your hand. Okay? How many of you would say by nature you're a pessimist? Okay? Pretty good split. Some of you didn't answer. That's okay. You're still trying to figure it out. So I don't know if it's because I'm by nature a pessimist, so I'm kind of drawn to the book of Ecclesiastes. But I've so appreciated just the skeptical honesty, like even almost the cynicism that is here. Like Solomon's just being honest. One of the things I hate is fakeness, right? I don't like the whole just being fake and excited when you're not really excited or positive. And so I appreciate the skeptical honesty. I mean, it's powerful in this book. It's refreshing to me because we all have times in our lives, at least I think we do, where this is what we feel. We feel what Solomon says here. We feel like, man, what's the point? What is the point of this? I think even the optimists in the room could say you've had times where you've questioned that. Like, what is the purpose? How in the world could a good God allow these things to happen? What is going on? And so we all have those times. And praise God that he's constructed a piece of his word that I think draws us from the cynicism back to Christ and back to faith. To say, even in the midst of the mess and the brokenness, God is still faithful. He is still good. And the end of the matter is what Solomon comes to the conclusion at the end of his book. And so as this introduction is completed, the book shifts from third person, talking about the teacher, to first person, the words of the teacher. And we'll flip back to the third person in the last chapter for the epilogue. But the next chapters go back and forth, answering this basic objection. We begin with proof in chapter 2 that all is vain. The teacher says, I've tried everything under the sun, and it's all without meaning. And then at the end of chapter 2, we actually see the book's thesis. All is meaningful if a sovereign God rules the universe. And that thesis is defended. It's objected to, it's defended. And then finally, we reach a conclusion in the epilogue in chapter 12. Well, what is the conclusion? If you flip over there in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, this is one of those verses that you probably know out of the book of Ecclesiastes. It says this in verse 13. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God, keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. So let me kind of take you through how this works itself out through the book of Ecclesiastes so you can see how it really makes one single argument with one single flow of logic. Chapter 1, verse 1, the introduction, the opening two chapters through chapter 2:23, they're an exploration of what the meaning of life might be. And once we get the introduction, the teacher spends the rest of chapter 1 and most of chapter 2 giving us a tour of his pursuit for relevance, for meaning, for lasting value in life apart from God. So he tries to find significance in things like wisdom, wine, laughter, riches, delicacies, his work, his projects, sex, power, fame. I mean, just full on material gluttony. If he wanted it, he got it. Sound familiar at all to kind of our culture's way of thinking? I mean, just do it, right? You be you. Chase your dreams. If it feels good, do it. That's what the teacher does. Apart from God, he seeks out everything he can get his hands on, everything that his eye desires, that his heart desires, he takes it. He says in chapter 2, verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Again, that phrase often provides us a cue to say he's talking about life only in the physical realm, with no regard for God and the things of his kingdom and spiritual things. So all this was no more successful at providing life with meaning and purpose and significance than chasing after and trying to grasp the wind. Impossible, right? So the psychological effect of this outlook in life, verse 17 tells us that the teacher actually hated life. Verse 23, all his days, his work is pain and grief. Even at night, his mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. There's no wonder he hated life. I mean, even the worldly enjoyments that he had all had to come to an end at some point. Everything ends and everything eventually dies. So it's a wonder that anyone ever has a smile across their face who takes this kind of approach to life. Well, that brings us to chapter 2, verse 24 through 26. Now, remember, the flow of thought is important. Nothing that man can do between birth and death has any lasting significance. Therefore, it has no value. But in verses 24 through 26, he's going to lay out the solution to this apparent vanity of everything under the sun. Look at what he says. Chapter 2, verse 24 through 26. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? To the man who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What a change in outlook that happens in these three verses. We see words like better and satisfaction, phrase from the hand of God, enjoyment and pleases and happiness. All of a sudden, the teacher has moved a long way from vanity and meaningless, striving after the wind, profitlessness. Well, what's changed? Well, it's the same facts, the same life, but now a new perspective, because now this is not just life in a vacuum, but life with God. It's not just life under the sun, it's life with a creator God. Read verse 24 again. A man can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in his work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. He says that the best thing a man can do is eat and drink and enjoy his work. Well, I thought he just said that all that was vanity. Why does he now recommend work? How is it that now he says there can be and ought to be satisfaction and enjoyment in all of life? That's what he means, by the way, when he uses the phrase eat and drink. It's a metaphor to mean everything that someone does, everything one does. For eating and drinking are the basis of all of activity. So it's a way of him saying everything that you do. So you should live life, according to him in these verses, you should be happy, and you should actually enjoy the work of your hands. So that same vain labor that he mentioned just a little bit earlier, now, all of a sudden, he's saying that's what you should do and enjoy and find satisfaction in. Well, what's the catch? Well, the catch is the rest of the verse. The text says literally that this too I have seen, that is from the hand of God. Solomon has seen many things. Obviously, chapter 2, verses 1 through 16, he begins to give a description of those things. But there is one other thing that he has seen, that eating and drinking, that is to say, the living of life and the enjoyment of one's work, comes from the hand of God. This changes everything, right? Before, Solomon was looking at life through the lens of the natural man under the sun, only through the physical lens. And we can understand this, right? He's reporting the things that he had seen with his eyes. This is what I've seen with my physical eyes. And when that is the only information gathering instrument used, his conclusions were sound, even though they're pessimistic. They were sound. But once he remembered that there is a creator of all of this creation, life all of a sudden took on a different purpose, a different means, a different end. And why is that? Why is it that which was once vain can now have meaning? Well, it's because the origin of every single activity that one undertakes is from the hand of an eternal and meaningful God. The only way that something temporal like our life can ever have eternal significance is if an eternal God orders it. Because he's a purposeful God, and he never does anything without reason or cause. And so that includes our lives. They're from the hand of God. That means he's in control of them. He gives them to us. He gives us our various tasks each day. And so in verse 25, we're asked the rhetorical question to back up this claim. He says, "For," indicating that proof for what has just been said is now coming. "For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment?" Well, the answer is everyone eats, and many people find enjoyment in eating without him. And just read Psalm 73. But it's only fleeting, vain enjoyment that they find. It's passing like a vapor. That's what Solomon says. Soon it'll be gone. It'll have no weight. It doesn't amount to anything. There's no significance in it unless it's from him. Unless, let's use the words of the text, without him. And so verse 26 makes sense, right? God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to whom he pleases. But to those to whom he does not give wisdom and knowledge and joy, they're left in the dark. They don't know him. They live without him. Therefore, their days are subject to that vanity of working, gathering, storing up wealth for someone else to inherit once they die. That is the vain life, attempting to live life in this creation apart from acknowledging the creation's creator. But God is the author and the providential Lord over all that happens, and since he does nothing in vain, nothing therefore is vain. Everything has meaning as it comes from an infinitely meaningful and glorious creator, God. So the theme of the book is meaningful. All is meaningful. Why? Because God has appointed it all. Well, Solomon, he has a different perspective on life. I mean, there is meaning and purpose to life because God has ordained all things that come to pass, and we're to trust and enjoy what God has given and revere such a God. So this common refrain, it appears a number of times throughout the book. Look at chapter 3, verse 12 through 14. I perceived perceive that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toils. This is God's gift to man. I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor nothing taken from it. God has done it so the people fear before him. That is meaning in life. And we essentially read the same thing. I listed these, and you can go look at them in your own time. Chapter 5, verse 18 through 20. Chapter 8, verse 15. Chapter 9, verse 7 through 10. He continues to give that same refrain throughout the book. So this, my friends, I actually think is an incredible book to be a gospel on-ramp for our culture. You probably haven't ever thought of the book of Ecclesiastes as material for a good investigative Bible study, but I actually think it would be quite fantastic. I mean, people in our culture live in the throes of this kind of mindset that I've just been talking about. And in their attempts to escape the meaninglessness of life, they just thrust themselves into all kinds of things. I mean, their jobs, their sexual exploits, their material hedonism, they're just going headlong. I mean, reckless abandon to try to find meaning in all of these different things in life. But in the end, it's the same outcome as Solomon. It's vanity. It's wasted. And what's so refreshing about the gospel is that it is an answer to such frustrating pursuits and futility. So I actually think, I see this as an opportunity all the time. With our coworkers, our friends, our family, our acquaintances, you share the message of Ecclesiastes. You know, man, as I look at our world, or you hear people complaining about just the rat race, or, you know, whatever it is that they're facing, and it's like, you know what? The Bible speaks to that. The Bible actually speaks to that. I think they're ripe to hear it. We do have a message of hope in a hopeless world. You know, you feel like you've been chasing after the dollar, and no matter how much you make, it's never enough, and you want more and you want more. You know, it's because that's not really the point of life. The Bible speaks to that. There's a story of a guy who talks all about that. I think it's a wonderful gospel on-ramp with our friends and family that don't know the Lord, who are caught up in this kind of thinking in our culture. So what about the rest of the book, though? What about the rest of the book? Sadly, we don't have enough time to go through every chapter, but you can use the outline that's there on the very back of your handout to kind of walk through it on your own as you study through this book. But having explained God's perfect timing for all things, the teacher goes on to cite humanity's main objection to God's goodness and sovereignty. And he does this starting in chapter 3, verse 16. And the objection is the problem of evil. We've all probably encountered this maybe in our own hearts and minds, but also as we talk to others. And so Solomon, he anticipates that. And he answers it in three parts. The first 7 verses of chapter 5 give us the same answer to the problem of evil that God gave to Job. And to paraphrase, it's this: shut up. I mean, that's really just to paraphrase, right? He says, who are you, created one, to challenge the Creator? God is in heaven. This is chapter 5, verse 2. God is in heaven, you are on earth, so let your words be few. That's his first part to the answer. The second part to his answer is found in chapter 7, verse 14. And it's a clear-headed assessment of prosperity in this world. So is a lack of material things a sign of God's curse? It's the question that's asked. Is a lack of material things a sign of God's curse? And perhaps the answer here, the second part of his answer, is that perhaps part of the problem of evil is a misunderstanding of what is really good. Perhaps part of the problem with evil, this is chapter 7, verse 14, go look at it, is that we don't really understand what is good. And then he gives a third answer at the end of chapter 7. Why do bad people, silly question, as there are no good people? Chapter 7, verse 29, this only I have found, God made mankind upright, but men have gone in search of many schemes. And so we end with a lengthy section in chapters 8 and following, a lengthy section of application. And it says basically this: obey the king, work hard, enjoy your spouse, seek wisdom, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And so as you study through this book and as you use this book, remember the flow of thought is really important to understand, really any part of any book, but especially the book of Ecclesiastes. You can't just come in and isolate a passage from its context and what led up to it. But once you can put the whole thing together, you begin to find a marvelous treasure in your study. So use this book. Use it when you're feeling cynical, when you're feeling pessimistic, when you're feeling skeptical. Use it as an honest path back to faith. Use it in evangelism. To honor the meaninglessness your non-Christian friend is grappling with, is struggling with. But not to leave them there, to bring them to the hope that the gospel brings. Use it to highlight the treasure of the gospel in your own heart. The book of Ecclesiastes never explains the gospel, right? It doesn't tell us who Jesus is and what Jesus did on the cross for us, but it does point us towards it. It moves us forward towards the gospel story. It tells us that God is sovereign and He is in control, that He can be trusted. And what is the greatest evidence for His trustworthiness in seeming meaninglessness? What is the greatest evidence of that? Well, it's that same sovereign God used the greatest tragedy in history, His Son's death on a cross, for our eternal benefit. And Ecclesiastes says that all are wicked, and yet meaning comes to those who please God. Well, how is it that the wicked can please God? Well, as you continue to read through the story, you find out that through faith in Jesus' sacrificial work on our behalf, that's how the wicked can please God, through His work, through faith in Him and what He has done. So it does lead us toward the gospel story. It does lead us to the story of Jesus, and it leads us to the greatest evidence that we have a sovereign God who can take what seems not just pointless and meaningless, but the greatest tragedy ever, the death of His Son on a cross, how that could be turned and used for our greatest benefit, for our eternal benefit. So praise God for this little gem of a book. I love it. I hope that provides a helpful framework for you guys as you study through it. I was looking back through some of my notes, man, it's just a powerful study. If you've never taken the time to really go through the book of Ecclesiastes, I'd encourage you to do so.